Thank you, thank you. Little gospel music in here today. All right. And that was an original song by Laura and then Janice on piano. Thank you so much for being here. Well, good morning. It's good to be back. I've missed you all. It's only been 2 weeks like usual, but it seems like longer for some reason. I don't know why. Oh, thank you, thank you. So it's good to be here. So last week you had a new guest speaker, Alexandra Musser. What'd you guys think? Yeah. I caught her talk on YouTube and loved how she brought in the book Atomic Habits, which I love. Have any of you read it before? Couple of us? Okay. So I loved how she bridged this, the very practical aspect of forming new habits with our divine identity. And I especially loved how she talked about acting from our divine identity, asking a question like, what would a healthy person do? So coming from that identity when we decide the actions that we take. So today we're going to continue along that theme a little bit, but it is Martin Luther King weekend. And so my talk today is titled, I Have a Dream. So I want to tell you a little bit about this speech. Of course, the famous speech by Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. that he gave at the Equal Rights March in Washington, D.C. in 1963. One of the things that I love is the way he opened that speech. He opened it with these words, I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation. What a declaration. And now we know, of course, that that's true, that that day has gone down in history as a great demonstration of freedom. It led to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But for Dr. King to get up there and make that declaration before he had even given his speech, I think is a true show of faith. So in the beginning of his talk, he talked about how it had been 100 years since the Emancipation Proclamation that freed black slaves in our country. And yet, even though it had been 100 years, that black people were still not free. That they were exiled to corners of American society, chained by poverty, beaten by police, and refused service at whites-only businesses. His speech was so powerful right from the beginning when you listen to the words. But when you watch the video, in those first few minutes, even though he said some powerful things, the crowd looked a little kind of bored. They were listening to him, but it had been a long day. He was towards the end of the day. It was summer in DC. It was probably hot. They were probably a little tired, so let's forgive them. But they weren't quite with him in the beginning. And I can just imagine being someone who stands in front of crowds and people and talks for a living, what it might be like to start with such a powerful declaration saying that this will go down in history, and then 5 minutes into my talk seeing that people are not really in it with me. But then there was a 10-second pause, and everything changed. So let me give you a little bit of a background. Dr. King had used that phrase, I have a dream, in multiple speeches prior to this one, with varying degrees of success. And in fact, he had used it so often that his advisors said, maybe don't for this one. They thought that phrase, I have a dream, was maybe a little overused, a little trite, a little cliche, and so he left it out of his speech. So in the beginning of his speech, he's reading these beautiful and powerful words, but it's just not quite getting the energy of the crowd going. And then he pauses, and Mahalia Jackson, who's standing on stage with him, who'd been to a lot of his rallies and knew his speaking style, shouted over to him from across the stage, tell him about the dream. And so in that moment, I can imagine Dr. King making a choice to follow what his outside world advisors who are well-versed in how to craft good speeches had told him to do and to say, or following his gut intuition and the call of spirit and saying what was on his heart. I have a theory that if he had followed his written speech that day, we would not remember that speech the way that we do. It was following that call of spirit, that call of his intuition that made that speech so powerful. That's why it's one of the top 3 speeches that we remember in American history, because it came from his soul and not from his intellect. So today we're talking about callings, about intuition, about what one of my friends calls God nudges. Those moments in our life where you're inspired out of nowhere to pick up the phone and call someone you haven't talked to in a while, where for some reason you think you need to turn down this street and you can't really reason out why, but you just feel that. Or that nudge to pick up a particular book that you haven't thought about and for some reason you're drawn to. That calling to all of a sudden abandon the path that you've been on and move in a different direction. Has anybody ever experienced that before?
Oh, yeah.
What does that feel like when that happens? I want to hear from you. What is that feeling, that calling, that nudge? How do you know that when it shows up in your life?
Oh, you're saying, oh no, it's something that you know you're being moved to do. You're not quite there to say yes. Eventually you do say yes, but at first it's like you feel it. It's a growing.
Like something's rising in you.
It is moving around.
And it's a little scary.
Yes, it is scary. It's very scary.
Yeah. Yeah, Carol.
It's just a boot in the rear end.
A boot in the rear end. Yes. Yes. And I loved in the Daily Word today how it talked about inspiration being a breath of God. Sometimes for me it comes across like that. The other way that we typically talk about inspiration is like light, a light bulb moment, a flash. Like all of a sudden it's like, have you ever had a situation where like you're mulling it over in your brain trying to figure it out and you can't figure it out, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh yeah, duh, why didn't I think of that earlier? That like spark of inspiration, it's almost like it comes from outside and just like it's not coming from you, it's coming from somewhere else. Does that resonate? Has that happened to you before? All right, so when I say calling, when I say God nudge, when I say intuition, that's what I'm talking about. That feeling, because that feeling is divine. It is the guidance of spirit. So in order to follow these callings and these God nudges, number 1, we have to have faith. So faith is one of our 12 powers up here. And January in Unity is typically the month we talk about faith, so look how perfect that worked out. So faith is what allows us to listen to that intuition. When we get that nudge, when we feel that thing bubbling up inside us, even if we're not quite sure how it's going to work out, maybe if we're not quite ready to say yes yet, we get that kick in the rear and we say, okay, that's where I'm going then. We have to have faith to be able to believe in the things that we can't yet see. I had the opportunity recently to speak with somebody who recently got their calling, their guidance from Spirit to pursue the Licensed Unity Teacher path. And for those that don't know, the Licensed Unity Teacher, LUT, is a path of leadership in Unity. And for the first couple years, it's actually the exact same as the ministerial path, and then they diverge a few years in. And so speaking with this person gave me the opportunity to think about my own ministry path. And I remember when I got my calling thinking, really? Really me? And I tried to reason with my intellect what being a minister would look like. And I tried to think about my prior career building technology and how that would translate into ministry. And I could try to come up with ideas of what that might look like, and it mostly involved stuff happening online, not in person. But my guidance from Spirit was clear: you're applying to ministerial school, and don't worry about how it's going to turn out at the end, you just move forward. And wouldn't you know, in school is when I realized that my prior career in nonprofits prepared me perfectly to be leading a church, and that actually being here in person is exactly where I'm meant to be. So oftentimes when we get those nudges, we don't know what it's going to look like when we're done. We don't know how it's all going to turn out, and maybe we're not supposed to. It is faith, that power and that faculty within us that allows us to just take that next step and trust in where we're being led. Nelson Mandela, who was a civil rights leader in South Africa, has a quote that I love: "It always seems impossible until it's done." Faith is what allows us to believe in the impossible. Without faith, we wouldn't even try. Faith is the reason that we have every single advancement that our human species has ever created. Unless someone was brave enough and had enough faith to believe that one day we could fly, we wouldn't have airplanes. Believing in the impossible, that I could communicate face to face with somebody 1,000 miles away, is what has made that possible today. Without faith, we would have nothing. So faith allows us to focus on what we want and the vision that we have for the future, rather than being focused on the things that aren't going right. It allows us to envision something better for ourselves, for our community, and for our world. My favorite definition of faith, and this truly is my favorite, and it just works out perfect that it happens to be from Dr. King. Faith is taking the first step, even when you can't see the full staircase. So faith is important. Without faith, we have nothing. The Bible says, without vision, the people perish. But the Bible also says that faith without deeds is useless. Or in other translations, it says faith without works is dead. So imagine you have a hole in your roof, and every time it rains, you've got water in your house. You need faith to hold a vision of having a warm and dry home, of having a full and whole roof that keeps you safe. But no matter how much faith you have that you deserve and are worthy of having a dry and safe place to live, you still have to call the roofer, right? Or as my friend Reverend Stacy Macris Ross says, you can't just sit around on your affirmations.
I like that one.
So this full verse in the Bible, it's in the book of James, chapter 2, starts about verse 14. It says, "What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but does not have works?" And he goes on to say that, let's say somebody walks in and they're naked and lacking daily food. And you say to them, "Go in peace, keep warm, and eat your fill." And yet you do not supply them with clothes and food. What is the good of that? Faith by itself, without deeds, without works, without action, doesn't do anything. What this verse, I think, is really calling us to is to having integrity in our spiritual path. So if we say that I believe in Unity's first principle, that there is one presence and one power active in the universe, God, the good, but then I act as if evil or something else is against me, I'm not living that faith. If I say I believe in principle number 2, that we are each created in the image and likeness of God, spiritual beings having a human experience, that in spirit we are all one, and yet I treat someone poorly, then I'm not living in integrity of my faith. He goes on to talk about some historical figures who have demonstrated their faith by the work that they do. Abraham, which is a whole story that I'll metaphysically interpret for you sometime, if you know that story about his son Isaac. Rahab, who gave shelter, who wasn't even part of their faith, but gave shelter to people that were running from persecution. And then the last line of this section says, by works, faith was brought to completion. By works, faith was brought to completion. What this is talking about is the natural law, the divine law, that what we put out in the world comes back to us tenfold. That as we give, so shall we receive. That it is the action that solidifies our faith and puts the law into motion. I think one of the most clear and powerful examples of works making faith complete is in the practice of tithing. We can say all day long that I believe that God is my source. I believe that I am prosperous and I believe that I am abundant. I know that the universe is working in my favor and conspiring to bring my greatest good to me. But if I am too scared to give because I think that when I need it, it isn't going to be there, I'm not living that faith, am I? In order for that divine law of circulation to work, we have to put it out into the world through our actions. By works, faith was brought to completion. And I think this is what Alex was talking about last week too, of coming from that divine identity. What would a healthy person do? What would someone who truly believes and trusts that God is their source and wants them to be abundant and prosperous, what would they do? It is by works that our faith is brought to completion. So when we have a dream, number one is to have faith. Have faith even if we can't see the whole staircase that dream is possible. And then number two, we have to act on our faith. That's principle number 5 in unity. It is not enough to believe this truth. You must live the truth that you know. So then on the path to realizing and manifesting and experiencing the completion of this dream that is tugging on us, this calling, this nudge, we may face some challenges and some obstacles. And I've heard it said in spiritual circles, well, if it's meant for me, it'll be easy. Salvador Dali even said it's either impossible or it's easy. And I think there is an interesting truth somewhere in there. I think that there is a lesson about the universe organizing itself in your favor, that when you're on the right path and you're following your calling in faith, that doors open and opportunities fall into your lap that you never could have predicted. I do think that's true. And I think that the idea that if it's for me, it'll be easy is a trick of the ego mind, of our human self that wants to keep us small and safe, that says, oh, if there's a challenge, then it must not be meant for me, so I'm not even going to try. So we've got to find that balance. Dr. King, of course, faced many challenges in realizing his calling. Assassination attempts and a successful one, being jailed dozens of times. Nelson Mandela, who became a symbol of hope to his people, who we now know as, right along with Dr. King, a leader in the nonviolent movement, anti-apartheid and desegregation. He was the first Black president of South Africa, but before that happened, he was sentenced to life in prison. Could you imagine following your calling, following what you are feeling Spirit urging you to do, stepping forward in faith, and then being sentenced to life in prison? I think even the most faith-filled among us would probably have a moment where we thought, oh, well, so much for that dream. And yet he continued on. So sometimes challenges and obstacles are an opportunity for us to reassess, to make sure that we're still on the right path, that we're not just going down this road because this is the road I've always gone down. And other times, the obstacles are there because in facing them, in overcoming them, we are developing our strength and we are learning lessons that we need to learn now to realize and manifest bigger and bigger dreams in our future. Has anyone seen the movie Evan Almighty? Came out in 2002, kind of like a modern retelling of Noah's Ark. Morgan Freeman plays God, which any movie with God in it as a person needs to be Morgan Freeman, right? Okay. So here's my favorite quote from that movie, from God, played by Morgan Freeman. If someone prays for patience, does God give them patience, or does he give them the opportunity to be patient? If they pray for courage, does God make them brave, or give them opportunities to be courageous? If someone prays for their family to be closer, does God zap them with the warm, fuzzy feelings, or give them opportunities to love each other? The obstacles that we run up against in the pursuit of our calling, following those God nudges, following that intuition, are often opportunities for us to develop the strength and the power and the skills that we need to live the life that we are dreaming of. So, what dream is planted on your heart? Where is Spirit nudging you? What vision are you holding for your life, for your community, and for the world? Know that the power of God is within you, and it is powerful enough to overcome any obstacle, and that with faith and perseverance, nothing is impossible for you. Nothing. It may seem crazy and audacious to think that one person could change the world. And yet the people who are crazy enough and audacious enough to think that they can change the world, those are the only people who do. And don't for a second think that your dream is too small or too personal to be divine. Anything that comes from that intuition, that has that feeling, that breath, that kick in the booty, that light that comes to you, because you know it, don't you? You know that feeling. That feeling is divine. And realizing that dream, even if it seems small and personal only to you, will absolutely change your entire world. And in oneness, in the oneness that we are in spirit, changing your world ripples out and has profound effects that you cannot even imagine. So do you have a dream? Take the first step in faith. Take action, and together we can create the world that we dream of. Thank you.